The courtroom was supposed to be a place of order, but when ex-soldier Ethan Walker fights to keep his military dog, Rex, chaos erupts. A dead man walks in, armed men storm the room, and a deadly secret is exposed. What are they really after? Don't miss this intense, action-packed story. Like and subscribe to follow more thrilling tales. The Trial of Separation. The courtroom was suffocating, thick with anticipation and the weight of unspoken truths. The wooden benches groaned under the weight of those who had come to watch, some for justice, others for spectacle. A row of journalists perched at the back, fingers poised over keyboards, eyes scanning for their next headline. But none of that mattered to Ethan Walker. Seated at the defense table, his military uniform still pressed to perfection, he gripped the armrests of his wheelchair with white-knuckled tension. His breathing was steady, but beneath the surface, a storm raged. His eyes, hardened by war, flickered only once, toward the loyal companion sitting beside him. Rex, a German shepherd with sleek, black and tan fur, his piercing amber eyes scanning the room like a sentry on duty. He didn't fidget. He didn't pant in anxiety. He simply waited, his massive frame coiled with quiet strength, ears flicking at every sound, every movement. To the government, Rex was property, a highly trained military working dog assigned for combat operations. To Ethan, Rex was everything. A judge, a stout, balding man with sharp, discerning eyes, lifted his gavel and tapped it twice. The court is now in session. His voice echoed across the high ceilings, commanding immediate silence. Sergeant Ethan Walker, you may proceed with your final appeal. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. Final appeal. This was it. He exhaled slowly, adjusting in his chair as he straightened his back, forcing himself to remain composed. Your Honor, Ethan began, his voice steady but laced with quiet desperation. I've given 20 years of my life to this country. I've followed orders. I've sacrificed everything. And now you're asking me to give up the one thing that saved me. He glanced down at Rex, his fingers brushing the dog's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. Rex isn't just a military asset, Ethan continued. He's my partner, my friend, my family. The judge leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, expression unreadable. The Department of Defense has ruled that Sergeant Rex must be reassigned to an ongoing classified mission, he said. He is still deemed combat capable and is government property. That word again, property. Ethan's jaw tightened. With all due respect, Your Honor, he said, his voice thick. Rex isn't a machine. He isn't some rifle you can hand to the next soldier. He saved lives. He saved my life. His voice cracked. There was a moment of silence. The courtroom, for all its tension, was motionless. Every breath held, every eye fixed on Ethan. He took a shaky breath. When I was on deployment, Rex dragged me out of an IED blast. When I was pinned down by sniper fire, he took a bullet for me. And when I came home, broken, unable to even look at my reflection, Rex was the only thing that kept me going. He's not a tool, Your Honor. He's my reason to wake up in the morning. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Even some of the journalists, who had come in expecting a routine military hearing, now hesitated, their hands hovering over their keyboards. The judge exhaled through his nose, fingers drumming on the desk. He looked conflicted. Ethan almost thought he had him, until the judge set his jaw and shook his head. I sympathize with you, Sergeant Walker, he said, but the law is the law. A heavy silence followed. Then, a growl. Low, menacing, the kind of growl that sent an instinctual shiver down your spine. Ethan's blood ran cold. He had heard that sound before, in the middle of a war zone, moments before all hell broke loose. Rex's body had gone rigid, his ears pinned back, hackles rising. His eyes weren't on Ethan. They were locked onto the courtroom doors. Ethan followed his gaze, a creeping unease settling in his gut. The massive oak doors leading into the courtroom stood firm, but something felt wrong. The murmurs in the crowd faded into a nervous silence. Then, Rex lunged forward. The leash slipped from Ethan's fingers. Gasps erupted as the German shepherd shot across the room, his body moving with trained precision. Rex, heel! Ethan commanded, his voice sharp with alarm. But Rex wasn't disobeying. He was protecting. His growls deepened as he planted himself between the judge and the entrance. His stance solid, his tail raised like a warning flag. The tension in the room thickened. "What's wrong with the dog?" one of the bailiffs muttered, shifting uncomfortably. Ethan knew. He knew. A second later, the heavy courtroom doors swung open, but not by a bailiff, by someone else. Three figures entered. The man leading them wore a long black coat, his face partially hidden beneath the hood. He moved with an unsettling confidence, his pace slow and deliberate. He wasn't here by accident, and Rex knew it. The bailiffs reached for their weapons. "This is a closed courtroom," one of them barked. "You need to—" The man finally stepped into the light, and Ethan froze, because he knew that face. He had seen it before, in classified mission files, on government watch lists, and in his worst nightmares. The man should not be alive. Yet here he was, standing in the middle of the courtroom, smirking. The murmurs turned into full-fledged panic. The judge, for the first time, looked shaken. "Who are you?" he demanded. The man ignored him. Instead, his piercing gaze locked onto Rex, and then he smiled. "I'm here for the dog." The silence was deafening. Ethan's entire body went ice cold. This wasn't about a reassignment. This wasn't about the military taking Rex back. This was something else entirely. Something far, far worse. And in that moment, as Rex growled, as the air grew impossibly heavy, Ethan realized one horrifying truth. He wasn't fighting the government anymore. He was fighting something much, much bigger. The man who shouldn't exist. A sharp, eerie silence hung over the courtroom. The three men who had just entered moved with the kind of precision that only trained operatives possessed. Their leader, the one in the dark coat, took another slow step forward. The dim overhead lights flickered slightly, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally across the polished floor. But Ethan wasn't looking at the shadows. He was looking at him. Victor Hale, a man who was supposed to be dead. 4 years ago, Victor had been a high-ranking black ops agent, rumored to have been part of missions that didn't exist on paper. The kind of missions where people disappeared. Then, on an operation gone wrong, he vanished. Officially, his death had been confirmed in a classified military report. Yet here he was, standing in front of Ethan, alive and well. And he wanted Rex. Ethan's grip on his wheelchair's armrests tightened. His pulse thundered in his ears. Victor's smirk deepened. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Ethan's voice was razor sharp. "I have." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Spectators shifted uneasily, sensing that whatever was happening wasn't normal. The bailiffs were still positioned near the judge, hands resting near their holsters. But there was a hesitation in the air, like they weren't sure if drawing their weapons was the right move. Because men like Victor didn't just walk into courtrooms. They walked through war zones. The judge cleared his throat, forcing authority back into his voice. "I don't know who you think you are, but this is a federal courthouse. You are trespassing." "I don't care," Victor interrupted coolly, his tone laced with amusement. His gaze flickered to Rex. "I didn't come here for you. I came for the dog." Rex's growling intensified, his body vibrating with tension. His stance was low, his shoulders squared, muscles coiled like a loaded spring. "Back away," Ethan warned, his voice steel. Victor let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "You still don't get it, do you?" He took another step forward. "Rex isn't just some military canine. He's special." Ethan's stomach twisted. Victor wasn't wrong. Rex had always been different. His ability to sense danger before it happened. His uncanny intuition. It was beyond instinct. On the battlefield, he had saved Ethan's life in ways no other dog could. But how did Victor know? Ethan's blood ran cold. Because this wasn't about military protocol. This was something else. One of the bailiffs stepped forward, his stance firm. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave, or we'll have no choice but to—" Victor raised a hand lazily. And then, the lights cut out. Total darkness. A collective gasp erupted across the courtroom. There was a rustle of movement, the sound of people shifting in panic. A woman let out a small shriek. Someone cursed under their breath. Ethan immediately reached for Rex, gripping the dog's harness. Then, a metallic clang echoed from the hallway outside. The sound was sharp, deliberate. Ethan's combat instincts kicked in like second nature. His mind raced, assessing every possible scenario. Power failure? Number two convenient. An attack? Maybe. Then something far worse crossed his mind. What if Victor wasn't alone? The bailiffs pulled out their flashlights, the beams cutting jagged paths through the darkness. The judge was barking orders, but panic was already unraveling in the courtroom. "Everyone stay in your seats," one bailiff ordered. Another noise, a footstep, but not from inside the courtroom, from the hallway. And it wasn't hurried. It was slow, deliberate. Rex let out a snarl, his body locked in place, not barking at Victor anymore, but at the door. A second later, the lights flickered back on. And standing in the doorway, just beyond the threshold, was another figure. He was tall, built like a soldier, dressed in all black. His face was partially obscured by a tactical mask, but his eyes, cold, calculating, and sharp as razors, were visible. The room froze. Ethan didn't recognize him, but he knew exactly what kind of man he was. A professional, a killer, and he wasn't alone. More movement, more shadows emerging from the hall. 3, 4, 5 of them, armed. Victor grinned, his eyes lighting up with amusement. "Ah, right on time." The largest of the masked men stepped forward, scanning the room like he was assessing threats. His voice was flat, emotionless. "We have confirmation. Target is here." Ethan's stomach dropped. Target. He knew in that instant they weren't talking about him. They were talking about Rex. The realization struck like a gunshot. This wasn't about some simple reassignment. This wasn't about bureaucracy. This was a mission, and Rex was the objective. Ethan's pulse spiked. His grip tightened on Rex's harness, his breath coming short and fast. This wasn't just some intimidation tactic. This was an extraction, a military-grade operation, playing out in a civilian courtroom. And that meant one thing. They weren't planning to leave without Rex, or without blood. Ethan's instincts screamed at him. "Move! Now get ready," he whispered to Rex. The dog didn't need to be told twice, because this battle had just begun. When hell breaks loose. The room erupted in chaos. Spectators scrambled backward, some bolting for the exits, only to be stopped by the sheer presence of the masked men blocking the doors. The judge stood frozen, gripping his gavel like it was a lifeline, his face drained of all authority. The bailiffs, trained, armed, but not ready for this, reached for their weapons. But it was clear from the get-go, they were outmatched. Victor Hale took a slow, deliberate step forward, his smirk never faltering. "Let's not make this difficult, Ethan," he said. "You hand over the dog. We walk out. No one gets hurt." Ethan's hands clenched into fists, his muscles tensing like coiled steel. His breath was slow, controlled, combat breathing, a technique ingrained in him from years on the battlefield. He had been outgunned before, outnumbered, and he had survived. But there was one difference between those times and now. This time, he had Rex. Rex wasn't just a weapon. He wasn't just a partner. He was the only chance Ethan had. Rex stood firm, his body low, his deep primal growl reverberating through the room like rolling thunder. His eyes locked onto the masked men, scanning their every movement. He was ready. Ethan's mind raced, calculating his options. They were boxed in. The exits were covered. The bailiffs wouldn't stand a chance in a shootout. No backup was coming. The only way out was through. His heartbeat slowed. He turned to Victor, his voice like sharpened steel. "I don't think you understand something, Hale." Victor raised an eyebrow. "Oh? And what's that?" Ethan's fingers found the clasp of Rex's leash. Click. The leash dropped, and all hell broke loose. The first move. Rex lunged with the force of a bullet, his powerful body springing into action. He slammed into the nearest masked man, a giant brute built like a linebacker. The impact was bone-crunching. The man staggered back, slamming against the wall. He barely had time to react before Rex sank his teeth into his forearm. The man screamed. Chaos detonated across the courtroom. Ethan was already moving. His military training took over. He yanked a bailiff's holstered pistol, twisting the weapon out of the stunned officer's grip. "Hey!" the bailiff yelled. But Ethan wasn't listening. His focus was singular. The masked men were reaching for their weapons. Ethan didn't hesitate. He fired. Bang! One of the masked men crumpled as the shot slammed into his shoulder, sending him spinning backward. Bang! Another took a bullet to the knee, dropping with a howl of pain. But Ethan wasn't naive. He knew bullets alone wouldn't stop them. These weren't ordinary mercenaries. These were specialists, trained killers. And now, they were pissed. Close combat, a shadow loomed, one of the larger men, moving fast. Too fast. Ethan barely had time to react before a fist crashed into his jaw. Pain exploded in his skull. His wheelchair tilted, the force nearly toppling him over. Stars burst behind his vision. But Ethan was a soldier, and soldiers don't fall. He used the momentum, twisting his body, bringing his elbow up in a brutal strike to the man's ribs. The mercenary grunted, stumbling back. That's when Rex struck again. The dog leapt, his jaws clamping down on the man's calf, tearing him down like a wolf taking down prey. The man screamed as he collapsed. Ethan spun, his mind moving faster than his body. Where was Victor? His eyes snapped to the center of the room. Victor wasn't moving. He just stood there, watching, like he was waiting for something. Ethan didn't have time to figure out what, because another masked figure rushed him. This one was smaller, faster. A knife glinted in his hand. Ethan barely managed to twist his body, avoiding the first slash, but the second caught his shoulder. Pain flared, hot and sharp. The blade tore through fabric and flesh, warm blood spreading across his uniform. The mercenary smiled. Bad move, because before he could pull back, Ethan grabbed his wrist. He twisted, hard. There was a sickening pop. The mercenary's arm snapped at the elbow. A shriek of agony filled the room. Ethan ripped the knife from his grip and, in one fluid motion, drove it into the man's thigh. The mercenary dropped, howling. 2 down. The escape plan. Ethan knew they couldn't hold out forever. They had seconds before reinforcements arrived. He looked at Rex. The dog met his eyes. And Ethan knew. They had to go. Now his eyes scanned the room. There, a side exit, near the judge's stand. He wheeled himself back, gripping Rex's harness. Come on, buddy. Rex understood. The two of them moved, but then, a gunshot. Ethan felt it before he heard it. The impact slammed into his shoulder. Pain erupted like fire. His body jerked. His wheelchair tilted. He went down. The world spun. Rex barked, frenzied, panicked. A shadow loomed over Ethan. Victor Hale, calm, collected, smirking. That, Victor mused, was almost impressive. Ethan gritted his teeth, fighting the darkness clawing at the edges of his vision. Victor crouched next to him, his voice soft, mocking. You don't get it, Ethan. He gestured toward Rex, who was still growling, snapping, refusing to back down. This isn't about you, Victor said. This is about him. Ethan forced himself up, ignoring the agony burning through his body. Victor just smiled. And then, the courtroom doors burst open. A new squad stormed in, dressed in full tactical gear. But these weren't mercenaries. These were federal agents, and leading them, a woman in a high-ranking military uniform, her face furious. Everyone on the ground, she bellowed. Victor cursed under his breath. Ethan, still bleeding, still holding on to Rex, finally allowed himself one sharp breath of relief. Because this fight wasn't over. But now at least, he wasn't fighting it alone. No one takes my dog. The courtroom exploded into motion. Shouts, orders, the rapid-fire stomps of tactical boots against the marble floor. Federal agents in full combat gear stormed in, weapons raised, their eyes locked on the mercenaries. The lead agent, a woman in her late 40s, Colonel Sarah Monroe, was the only person in the room who looked more furious than Ethan. Her voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Everyone on the ground, weapons down, now! The mercenaries hesitated, their eyes darting toward Victor Hale, waiting for a command. But for the first time, Victor didn't look amused. His smirk had vanished, because even he knew this was bad. He turned his head slightly toward his remaining men and gave the smallest of nods, a silent order. And then all hell broke loose. Again, the final stand. One of the mercenaries spun, his rifle coming up. Bang! A single shot from a federal agent took him down before his finger could even reach the trigger. That was all it took. The room ignited into chaos. Gunfire erupted, the deafening sound bouncing off the wooden walls. Spectators screamed, diving for cover. The judge vanished beneath the bench, his gavel long forgotten. Ethan, bleeding, hurting, but still alive, dragged himself behind an overturned table. Rex pressed against him, hackles raised, growling. Through the chaos, Ethan locked eyes with Victor. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. Then, Victor ran. The chase. Ethan wasn't letting him go. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself up, pain screaming through his body. His vision blurred, but he shoved it aside. Rex was already moving, instincts razor sharp. Victor was fast, but Rex was faster. The mercenary burst through a side door, disappearing into the hallway. Rex launched forward. Ethan grabbed onto the dog's harness, letting Rex pull him along as he moved, his wheelchair flying forward with force. The hallway was dim, emergency lights flashing red. Sirens blared from somewhere outside. Ethan's breath was ragged. Blood dripped from his shoulder, staining his uniform, but his grip on Rex never loosened. They weren't letting Victor get away. The secret revealed Victor rounded a corner, sprinting toward an unmarked door at the end of the hall. Ethan saw it too late. Victor shoved it open, revealing an underground service tunnel. He wasn't escaping into the streets. He was escaping downward, straight into a hidden facility beneath the courthouse. Ethan's blood turned to ice. This wasn't just a courtroom dispute. This was bigger, way bigger. Victor looked back one last time. His eyes met Ethan's, and then he was gone. The door slammed shut behind him. A choice, Ethan skidded to a stop. His mind screamed at him to go after Victor, to finish this. But then, Rex whined, nudging Ethan's good arm. And that's when Ethan heard it. Gunfire. From back in the courtroom. The fight wasn't over. Ethan clenched his fists. Damn it. Victor was gone. For now. But his men weren't. And Ethan wasn't leaving without finishing this. He turned Rex around, and they charged back toward the fight. The end game. The courtroom was a war zone. 2 federal agents were down, one clutching his leg, the other unconscious. Mercenaries were pinned behind overturned benches, exchanging fire with the feds. Ethan didn't hesitate. He wheeled himself forward fast, using momentum to drive himself straight into the nearest mercenary. The man didn't expect it. Ethan slammed into him, knocking him backward, just as Rex leapt. The German shepherd tore the man down, sinking his teeth into his arm, sending his gun skidding across the floor. Ethan grabbed it, spun, fired, bang. The last mercenary dropped, and just like that, the room fell silent. Aftermath smoke curled through the air. The scent of gunpowder burned in Ethan's nose. It was over. Colonel Monroe stepped forward, lowering her rifle. Her sharp eyes met Ethan's. "You good, Walker?" Ethan exhaled. "Been worse." Monroe nodded, then turned to her men. "Secure the prisoners. I want Hale's men in custody now." Ethan barely heard her. His focus was on Rex. The dog panted, his ears still alert, his eyes scanning the room for threats. His fur was matted with dust, but he was alive. Ethan reached out, placing a shaking hand on the dog's back. "Good boy," he murmured. Rex's tail thumped once. The decision. Monroe stepped beside Ethan. "You know this isn't over, right?" she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "Victor got away." "Yeah, and whatever's under this courthouse, we're going to find out." Ethan looked at the hidden door Victor had escaped through. He thought about everything that had happened. The attempted kidnapping, the hidden facility, the fact that Rex had been the target all along. And then he made his decision. "I'm coming with you," Ethan said.